I hope and pray that you are having a blessed day. This morning we are going to conclude our series of lessons from the book of Nehemiah entitled Rebuilding the Wall. And we've been talking about rebuilding what's broken, whether it's in our own lives, those broken walls in our lives, the relationships, the things that we're struggling with, those areas in our life that aren't right, or maybe it's in our church family, the church that we are a part of, the congregation, and there's broken walls that need repairing. Maybe it's our community, or most definitely our world that we live in. So we've been focusing on, we 2 weeks ago we looked at us starting to rebuild and the groundwork, the preparation that we need to do, which includes prayer. That was number one on the list. But first of all, before we even get there, we need to acknowledge. We need to recognize the problem. We need to make an honest assessment. Then as we do that, prayer is bathing that process. We set goals and make them known, as well as getting others involved, helping others, that resources that are able to assist us so that we can rebuild these walls. Last week we looked at the actual rebuilding, what it's going to take. And I guess if you don't if you don't remember anything else about last week's lesson, I hope you go back and check it out if you haven't seen it. If you don't remember anything else, it is that first of all, God's got to be involved, and that's why prayer is so important. Holy Spirit working behind the scenes. But our part, we've got to work with all of our hearts. We can't sit back and expect someone else to do it. Doesn't matter if we're the leaders or we're one of the followers. We have a responsibility, every one of us, and we need to work with all of our heart. We need to be focused on that. We need to start close to home. And so those are some of the lessons we learned last week about the rebuilding, about what it's going to take to rebuild those broken walls in our lives, in the church, in our world. And today, our lesson is entitled Keep Rebuilding. And as I said, this is our final lesson in this series. So we've seen start rebuilding, and now keep rebuilding. We're going to start in Nehemiah chapter 2 and verse 10. Nehemiah 2 and verse 10, it says, "But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah an Ammonite, who was a government official, heard of my arrival," this is Nehemiah, "they were very angry that anyone was interested in helping Israel." So remember, Nehemiah had come back to, he'd never been to Jerusalem. So he comes to Jerusalem when he hears that the walls are still unrepaired after almost 100 years of exiles having been returned to Jerusalem. And so he's concerned, and he's gone to the king, and so he's come there. Now, remember in last week's lesson, one of the points was that there were some individuals from cities that were under the authority of the governors of the Trans-Euphrates. And we saw that, we made mention last week that that was the opposition. Those were the enemies. Those were the ones that were opposed to the rebuilding of the wall. And those individuals, even though they were under the authority, the government above them was opposed to the rebuilding of the walls. That didn't stop them from getting involved. Well, these individuals mentioned here, Sanballat, Tobiah, these are some of those governors of the Trans-Euphrates, or at least some of their officials. And so when they heard that Nehemiah had come from Persia to get to work on rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, they're angry. They're upset. They don't want this. They want Israel. They want Jerusalem to be unprotected. They want them to be vulnerable. They wanted to have an advantage over them. And so they're upset when they hear this. So first and foremost, we need to remember, we need to know that if we are going to do some rebuilding in our lives, in our churches, in our world, we're going to face opposition from the enemy. That's a given. That's a reality. That's a fact. Don't go into this, and I believe so often this happens. We go into this, well, this is God's will. This is what God wants. We're going to rebuild. We saw, what they were able to do to rebuild these walls in our first lesson. They were able to complete it in 52 days. And the nations around said, wow, their God's with them, and praise the Lord. And yes, that's true. But the reality is they didn't do this unopposed. That there were enemies that were opposing them. So we're going to look at that. What to do when the enemy opposes us. That's going to be the message as we talk about keep rebuilding. It's not enough to get started. It's not enough to work on it. But it's got to be that it's going to continue even when the opposition comes against us, when the enemy tries to stop us. How do we handle that? Someone posed a question last week to me why I think the church here in Park Rapids isn't being blessed. And I believe this is one of the reasons. I believe that every time opposition arises, it keeps us from doing the work that needs to be done. It keeps us from being effective in our work because our focus is taken off of what it should be on. And it needs to be on, first of all, God and glorifying Him. Second of all, reaching out and sharing the good news of Jesus and helping this world to be a better place through the good news of Jesus Christ. And that's got to be our focus, whatever opposition comes against us. So let's look at this opposition that came against them as they were rebuilding the wall. First of all, Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 11. Nehemiah 1, verse 11. This is early on. This is even before he gets back to Jerusalem. This is the internal opposition that the enemy brings. Nehemiah 1:11. Nehemiah says, this is a prayer. "O Lord, please hear my prayer. Heed the prayers of those of us who delight to honor you. Please help me now as I go in and ask the king for a great favor. Put it into his heart to be kind to me." If you remember the story of Esther, and when she came to approach, this is her husband, the king. She's the queen, and she's fearful because she knows that if she approaches the king and she is not invited, called in, that the only hope she has is that he lowers the scepter to her and she's allowed to enter. And if he doesn't lower his scepter to grant her entrance, she's executed. So there's fear. And I think that might be the case. Now, Nehemiah in this instance was a cupbearer for the king. So he's one of the king's servants. And so at this point, he wants to talk to the king. He wants to share the need that is going on. But there's fear. There's doubt. And so that's one of the things, and I think one of the most powerful things that the enemy does, and he starts it right in here, and he starts it in you, and he starts it in me, and that is the enemy will cause fear and doubt. That's what the enemy is going to do. He's going to try to cause fear and doubt within us. And I believe that's what the psalmist is referring to in Psalm 13, verse 2. The psalmist writes, "How long is my soul to be in doubt, with sorrow in my heart all the day? How long will he who is against me be given power over me?" And listen, that's what it feels like when you let that doubt and that fear take root in your life. And so we start to question, we start to wonder, well, is this the right thing? Is this really God's will? Is this what it's going to take to rebuild the walls? And we start to second guess, and we start to question, and we start to struggle. And that becomes a palpable feeling. And I think within a group, whether it's individually we feel it, but within a group, I think that can be felt throughout the group, that it can get this attitude of fear and doubt. And I believe, and I don't just believe, I know the enemy, our enemy, the devil. The one that has rebelled against God is behind that. And so then how should I respond when I am faced with the opposition of the enemy's fear and doubt that he's putting in me, that he's trying to control me with? How should I respond? Let's look at what Nehemiah does. Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 4. Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 4 says, this is after he's come in the presence of the king. Well, what should be done? The king asked. With a quick prayer to the God of heaven, I replied, if it pleases your majesty, and if you look upon me with your royal favor, send me to Judah to rebuild the city of my fathers. So Nehemiah, what does he do? He prays. And we're going to see that throughout this lesson. Pray. So he prays, and he does it anyway. He prays, and he goes in and makes his need known before the king. The king asks specifically, then what do you want me to do? And Nehemiah prays again and tells him specifically, send me to Jerusalem to rebuild those walls. Brothers and sisters, when the enemy opposes us, we need to pray. Whatever we're doing, wherever we're at, we need to pray and do it anyway. Those things that we're fearing, doubting, sometimes it might be the wrong thing we're doing. Let me tell you, if you're praying about it, God is going to direct that. God will guide that. God will steer that action to what it should be. Inactivity is something that God can't steer. Listen, you need to pray and do it anyway. If you're facing fear and doubt, the tendency is to be paralyzed, to do nothing, to sit back and just do nothing. Don't let Satan do that. Take a step, do something. Step out, God's going to use that, but it starts with prayer. Secondly, how does the enemy oppose us? Look at chapter 4 now, verse 1. Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 1. So when Sanballat, remember he's one of those government officials from the Trans-Euphrates, when Sanballat heard that we Jews had begun rebuilding the wall, he became furious and began to ridicule us. In fact, in one of the places here it says, they mocked and they said, you know what, that wall you're starting to build, it's so weak that if a fox runs across it, it's going to knock it down. You guys don't know what you're doing. You're not going to be able to accomplish this. Ridicule. Ridicule. The enemy will ridicule. And know this, understand this, that wherever that ridicule comes from, whether it's from a trusted individual in your life, someone you care about, know very well. Maybe it's a brother or sister in Christ even. And that does happen. Maybe it's coming from, someone you obviously know is an enemy that is opposed to you. And definitely we know that is coming from our number one enemy, and that's Satan. We know that the devil is going to ridicule and mock because that's one of his tools. And so, again, how should I respond? When he's throwing this ridicule, when he is mocking our efforts, when he's telling us it's not going to accomplish anything, it's not going to amount to anything, that you're not doing a good job, how do you respond? Well, let's see what Nehemiah does and the people of Israel, the people of Jerusalem. Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 4. Nehemiah, well, it says, again, this is Nehemiah, I prayed. Hear how they make fun of us, O God. Let their ridicule fall on their own heads. Let them be robbed of everything they have, and let them be taken as prisoners to a foreign land. And then skip down to verse 6. So we went on rebuilding the wall, and soon it was half its full height because the people were eager to work. The enemy ridicules. But what does Nehemiah do? He prays. He prays to God and he says, God, turn their ridicule back upon them. Turn it back upon the enemy. And so when the enemy is attacking you, when he's ridiculing you, remind the enemy, remind Satan that our God has defeated him by the cross, that Jesus gained the victory over him. And you know what's waiting for him? A lake of fire and brimstone. You know, we talk about hell and whether there's a hell or not. Yes, I believe there's a hell, but hell was not prepared for you and I. Hell was prepared for the devil and his angels. And sadly, if we refuse to follow Jesus, we may suffer that same fate. If we fail to receive the salvation that Jesus offers freely by his death on the cross, then we may share that same fate. But remember, that is prepared for him. And so remind him he's defeated, and that's where his destiny is. And listen, pray, pray, pray. Pray that ridicule turns back on the enemy, and know that we need to keep working. Pray and keep working. That's what they did. They kept working. They didn't let the ridicule stop them. They kept working, and what was the result? They built the wall. They accomplished getting it up to half the height in a relatively short period of time. Not just relatively, a very short period of time. For, as we saw last week, the extensive wall, the amount of wall that they were building. And so, thirdly, another attack or opposition from the enemy. How does the enemy oppose us? Verses 7 and 8. Nehemiah 4 again, verses 7 and 8. Picking up right where we left off. So they went on working, and the wall's going up there. It's half its height of what it's going to be. And remember, last week we talked about we're not talking little walls. These walls on average were about 40 feet high, so they're already at 20 feet on average. So verses 7 and 8, when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the people from Ashdod heard that the repair work on the walls of Jerusalem was making progress and that the gaps were being filled in, they became furious. All of them plotted to attack Jerusalem to create confusion. They've tried the enemy has tried with fear and doubt. The enemy has tried opposing them with ridicule to stop the work from being done. And now, all out attack. The enemy is plotting to attack. So, if that's where we are, if the attacks are coming, how should I respond? Well, again, let's see what Nehemiah does. Chapter 4, verse 9. Nehemiah 4:9. But we prayed to our God. Notice the first two, he prayed. Now he's involved the rest of them. But we prayed to our God and appointed guards to watch for them day and night. In fact, it also talks about that some of the workers would work with the tool in one hand and a sword in the other hand. They were prepared. They were prepared for attack. They had guards set up. They had trumpeters to, if there was an attack, that the trumpet would sound and that reinforcements would come to help them. So the attacks are going to come. The enemy is going to plot attacks. The enemy is going to try to create confusion by attacking us. So how, if the enemy attacks, if they're going to attack, how should I respond? How should I respond? Well, we've just seen. It says they prayed together. And then they were on guard. We need to be on guard. You and I need to be on our knees praying, because the attacks are going to come. The enemy is going to attack us. He's going to attack us with temptation. He's going to attack us with accusations. He's going to attack us, again, with more of the fear and doubt and the ridicule. He is going to throw every tool in his book, and this enemy that we face has been around for a long, long time, much longer than you and I have been around. He knows all the tricks. He knows the attacks. In fact, we're pretty good about revealing what attacks work on us. Be careful what you're thinking, but more importantly, be careful what you're speaking. because the enemy, he's hearing you. And the enemy is going to take what you're saying and he's going to use it against you. So pray. Pray positive. Pray for, instead of, and listen, this is important. Lord, I just don't want to get sick. What did I just tell the enemy? I don't want to get sick. But instead, what if I pray, Father in heaven, give me health. Restore my health. Enemy doesn't hear those kind of things. He doesn't hear the positive. He hears the negative. Be careful what you're speaking. Be careful how you're praying. Don't pray negative. Pray positive. Listen, pray, but also be on guard. Remember what Peter says, be on guard. Watch out. The enemy is like a roaring lion going around looking for someone to devour, and that could be you. So be on guard. Pray and be on guard. Fourthly, Nehemiah chapter 6, verse 9. Look at the first part of verse 9. It says they were just trying to intimidate us, imagining that they could discourage us and stop the work. Skip down to verse 13. So that was the first part of verse 9. Skip down to verse 13. It says they were hoping to intimidate me and make me sin. Then they would be able to accuse and discredit me. The enemy is always looking for ways to intimidate. They're looking for ways to get you trapped in sin. The enemy is looking for a way that he can, as it says here, accuse and discredit you. And listen, accusing, remember, that's what Satan is. He is the accuser. That's what the enemy does. He makes false accusations. Sometimes they're truthful. Sometimes we have created a reason to be accused. But very often these accusations have no foundation and the enemy throws them at us just so that we will get caught in the trap. So be careful. How do we handle that? How do we handle, as it says there, they will intimidate. Intimidation. The enemy acts like they have power over us. The enemy acts like they can control us. They can destroy us. The enemy acts like they are more powerful than our God, but our enemy is not, and we need to remember that. And so how should I respond? Look at the second part of verse 9. The enemy has sent ridicule. But it says in the second part of Nehemiah 6, verse 9, but I prayed, God, make me strong. God, make me strong. In the midst of the intimidation, pray, God, give me strength. I trust in your power. You are great. You are more powerful than the enemy. You have given us the victory. Jesus won the victory through the cross. Satan thought he'd won when he had Jesus killed, but he didn't realize that he was signing his eternal death warrant. By killing Jesus, Jesus couldn't be held by death. And the power of the resurrection gives us hope. So what should we do? When intimidation comes, pray and stay strong. So, what was the outcome? What was the outcome of, first of all, the rebuilding that we looked at? The starting rebuilding we looked at the first week, the rebuilding we looked at last week, and the keep on rebuilding that we've looked at today. What's the result? Well, we saw they were able to finish this project, this huge project, this seemingly impossible project of rebuilding these walls that are anywhere from 1.7 to 2.5 miles long, 40 feet high and 8 feet wide. They were able to do it in 52 days. But afterwards, they finished it. This is the dedication of the walls. Nehemiah 12 and verse 43. That day they offered great sacrifices, an exuberant celebration because God had filled them with great joy. The women and children raised their happy voices with all the rest. Jerusalem's jubilation was heard far and wide. Brothers and sisters, If you're rebuilding those walls in your life, listen, when you rebuild them with God's help, His power, because you keep working no matter what. If you're rebuilding the walls of the congregation, the church that you're a part of, because they're broken down and they've been under attack and they're weak and they need shoring up, and you work and you're letting God be in control. If you're working in our world to build up the walls that are being broken down with God's help, His power working in us, and you keep on, in spite of the opposition of the enemy, you just keep building. The result is the walls will be rebuilt with God's power. And we, as it says there, we're going to offer great sacrifices, exuberant celebration, great joy, happy voices, and jubilation that is heard far and wide. Do you want to be living like that? Do you want to be a part of a church that has that kind of celebration? Then we need to start rebuilding, rebuild, and keep rebuilding. God bless, and have a wonderful week.